Okay, so this is dot plots part 2. This is actually getting into the analyzing of the data. So I want you to record the dot plots are useful for seeing clusters and gaps in the data set. They are also useful for seeing values that stray from the general shape of the data. So if this was our example, and you don't have to make this one right now, we'll make one in a second. Ages of cats at a local shelter. So looking at this data, we can see that we have a little bit over here, we have a little bit over here, and one way over there. Well, distribution, and again, I want you to write these 4 things down. Distribution is the way that the data is spread out over all possible values. You can use words like cluster and gap to describe the distribution. So we have a cluster of data here and a cluster here. Well, there's a gap here. And we're going to, gaps are areas where there are significantly smaller numbers of dots. Clusters is where you have a higher, level of dots that are stacked on top of each other. And then values that stray are dots that are located far away from a main set of data. So looking at our data set here, we have, this is how it's distributed. Our clusters are in this area and in this area. Our gaps are here and here. And our values that stray, we have one over here that's away from the rest of our data. So this and these 4 pieces of information need to be recorded for your notes for how to analyze the dot plot. So identify the clusters, the gaps, and the data values that stray. So here we have the list of data. Don't worry about that. We can just look at this together. I do want you to copy this chart, though. You can make the graph. So we're talking about plant heights, and the data is height. So we can see once you make, so pause the video if you need to so you can make this, and then get back with me. So we've got our cluster here, and we have a cluster here. And then in the middle, this area is a gap. Let me make that a little bit differently. I like that better. And then we don't really have any data that strays. If we had a plant that was like maybe 20 inches, centimeters tall, that would be one of the stray points. But we don't have any stray points in this one really. I mean, you could technically call that one, but we're not going to worry about that. So we have clusters here, a cluster here, and then there's no data in the middle. All right, so the last one is the dot plot shows how many hours plant researchers spent in the laboratory last night. Identify the clusters, the gaps, and any data values that stray. So you can just look at this one, we'll talk about it. We have a cluster of data here. That's our cluster. So again, you can just watch. We have our gap here. And then we have our stray data that's over here. So that's what it's talking about when we're talking about clusters, gaps, and straying. And all of this is the distribution of the data. So what kind of information can a dot plot easily show you? Going back to our original question from the first video. And then what types of situations might you want? So a dot plot can show you clusters, gaps, and data that stray. It shows you individual dots to represent each value in a data set. You might want to use that information when you need to look at the specifics of how data are distributed. So that's your last note to record. So cross off the word sample, but this needs to be written down. That'll be what I'm going to be definitely checking for in class tomorrow, that you got the main point of why we have data dot plots and why it's useful. That's into part 2 in dot plots.